So, of course, look, I can admit it. I was wrong. Brian Berletic was on this program. We're going to play a video from him because he has good analysis on this. Don't worry, he'll be back on the show likely next month. But I was hesitant to believe that it would happen this quickly, that the tanks would be promised to Ukraine, but they have been. And so there's been over 30 promise of these M1 Abrams tanks, these heavy equipment tanks to Ukraine. And of course, Germany has promised up to 100, but I believe the first batch was something like 14. But NATO is all in right now. They're trying to send as much as they can to Ukraine to fortify it for some kind of spring offensive. That's really been the narrative. But will it turn the tide? Will it really shift the battlefield? How will it affect the battlefield? And I want to play how Brian Berletic sees it because he has more military expertise than me. My analysis of this, though, from a political perspective and from a geopolitical perspective, is that Russia is not Iraq. Russia is not a small country like Afghanistan, a smaller, poorer country, underdeveloped, that had already gone through decades of imposed destitution and proxy war. Indeed, Russia is much more stable than that, and its military is much more high-tech than that. And I think that there is an underestimation of how Russia can and will respond to these tanks heading to the battlefield. And one of the things that Brian Berletic is going to note here that I find the most interesting is this idea that these M1 Abrams tanks that the United States is going to be sending are actually a pretty challenging to operate, and you need kind of a combined arms system. You need a training apparatus around them. It takes time. And the United States, I think and agree with this wholeheartedly, the United States is not going to want to see these tanks, which Russia can do, get targeted and ultimately get blown away by Russian strikes. So these tanks are really just the beginning, because these tanks cannot just go to the battlefield on their own without being subject and vulnerable to Russian fire. Like that's just the reality, because Iraq didn't have that capability, even though they had tanks, but they had much lower technology all the way around. They didn't have the capability to really push back against the United States when the United States invaded. But let's hear what Brian Berletic has to say. I'm going to play it on 1.25 speed because there's about 10 minutes of it I want to get through. But he has a great video updating us about this, and he makes some really good points that I definitely want to follow up on and definitely want you all to hear. So let's begin with friend of the show, Brian Berletic.
And we have to remember that all of the same problems that face the idea of sending main battle tanks and all of this other NATO armor to Ukraine, all of these same problems existed when the US and their allies sent things like the HIMARS, M270s, and M777 towed howitzers. They had all of the same problems. They would never be able to get the number of artillery pieces necessary to match Russia, and they'd never be able to use them effectively on the battlefield because of constraints in training, and also because none of these weapon systems are meant to go on the battlefield and fight in a conflict on their own. They are supposed to be part of a combined arms force, and you're supposed to include sufficient amounts of artillery, armor, infantry, and air power, and Ukraine doesn't have any of these things, not nearly in the numbers that they need to fight effective modern combined arms warfare. But let's get into the topic of main battle tanks.
So before we get into that topic, though, I mean, it's that point again that Ukraine will need. So this is the thing about Ukraine, in my opinion, is that Ukraine was supposed to be a proxy. It's not supposed to be some kind of force that can equal or match the military might and power and arsenal of the United States or NATO. But in order to confront Russia using Ukraine, there has to be a maximization of Ukraine's capabilities, and Ukraine isn't even close to being where it needs to be to use these tanks effectively. So these tanks are, I think, an extension of the political theater, because there was political theater going on that, to Brian's credit, and I think to my chagrin, that political theater was always going to lead to these tanks being sent. But will these tanks turn the tide? It appears that on this point alone, there are major challenges that Ukraine has to confront. And it's January 26th, as of today, at least. And it's much later out east. So the winter is fast moving, and Russia is also fast moving in terms of how it is striking Ukrainian infrastructure and also taking on more offensive operations and pushing that defense line forward into places like Zaporozhye. So let's continue with Brian.
Said previously that all of this back and forth over Leopards and Abrams, this was all theater, and that eventually Germany would definitely be sending Leopards, and the US would most likely send Abrams. Now we have this from the BBC. US and Germany ready to send tanks to Ukraine, reports. And the article says, US President Joe Biden's administration is expected to announce plans to send at least 30 M1 Abrams tanks. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has also reportedly decided to send at least 14 Leopard 2 tanks. He is set to speak in Parliament on Wednesday morning. The article admits that it could take months to send these tanks. Yes, at a minimum, it will take months to train Ukrainians on the rudimentary operation of these vehicles, create the supply chains necessary to sustain them on the battlefields, at least. And that's just to get them rolling on the battlefields and possibly firing their gun in the right direction. This is all analysis by Jonathan Beale, a BBC defense correspondent. It says Ukraine is still unlikely to get the 300 modern main battle tanks. It says it needs to win the war. I wouldn't bet on that. I think they're going to continuously increase this number. But if half a dozen Western nations can provide 14 tanks, then that would bring the total to nearly 100, which could make a difference. No, it cannot, and I'll explain why. Western tanks, including the UK's Challenger 2, Germany's Leopard 2, and the US-made Abrams, are all seen as superior to their Soviet-era counterparts, like the ubiquitous T-72. And that is not true, and this is all based on the performance of the US M1 Abrams in Iraq. And the situation in Iraq is entirely different than the situation in Ukraine right now. And the T-72s that the US fought and destroyed in Iraq are completely different than the T-72s and also T-90s and T-80s that Russia is using in Ukraine right now. Now, in my last update, I talked about this Twitter thread.
So before we get into that, I mean, the point is clear here, is that it's going to take months for these tanks to become operational. So the fact that this decision was made so late the winter, you could say, has just started, but Russia is on the move. And the whole reason why these tanks in the first place are the subject of such concern is because Russia has been not just the partial mobilization, it's not just that there are all these troops mobilized ready to go, it's that they are going. Now, Russia, I don't believe, has even used a major fraction of these troops on the front line. So Russia has a lot more coming, and Russia's military infrastructure is much more powerful than the West wanted all of us to believe. They wanted all of us to believe Russia's weak, Russia overestimated, but now we see the desperation. We see them throwing as many tanks as they want to here, because the fact of the matter is that, as Brian is about to explain, it's just not enough. And also there's this time factor. So I look at the time factor as being hugely important here. The United States and NATO are not looking at this as a conflict that is going to conclude. They're looking at it as a permanent war of attrition. While Russia understands it's a war of attrition, but has a goal to end it by whatever means, will end it, whether it's through forcing negotiations, because at this point, no one on the US, NATO, Ukraine side is willing to engage in them good faith, or through military means. It's not going to stop. And we're likely going to see an acceleration of this in the next month or two, in the next 4 to 6 weeks. I can't imagine that the battlefield will stay stagnant, given how Russia's already pushing into Zaporozhye, the Soledar victory, Bakhmut is being encircled. There's all these hot points on that defense line that Ukraine has attempted to hold on to after the Kherson and Kharkov offensives months ago, and they haven't been able to make any progress. Now these tanks are not even going to be operational for weeks, if not months. And as Brian is going to explain, there's much more to it that makes this question of whether these tanks are going to change anything a very prescient given Ukraine's situation. So let's continue.
By Lieutenant General Mark Hertling of the U.S. Army, retired, and he is talking about all of the actual problems of sending M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And I'm not going to read through this again, but I will go over the points briefly. He says the M1 Abrams requires long periods of training, and it's not just to teach the crew to operate the tank itself, it's also to teach the tanks how to fight together as a unit. He says the M1 Abrams requires the most training among both NATO and Soviet-era tanks in terms of firing the main gun. And the M1 Abrams driver needs a lot of training because a poorly trained driver is going to destroy the engine. It is a multi-fuel turbine engine, and once you break it, you have to replace it, which is not a trivial task on a battlefield in Eastern Ukraine or Western Russia, depending on your point of view. Regarding maintenance, he points out that you cannot just have a Ukrainian jet engine technician work on an Abrams engine just because it's a turbine engine. He points out that you have to have an experienced and certified technician that has knowledge and is certified specifically on the Abrams engine. And he points out that it's true that Iraq and Saudi Arabia operate M1 Abrams tanks, but Iraq had a 5-year training program before they began using them, and Saudi Arabia had a 7-year training program. As I've pointed out many times before, it takes years to properly integrate a heavy weapon system like this into your military. It took Ukraine years to integrate the Bayraktar TB2 drone.
So years, Brian Berletic is saying years. And so Brian Berletic, remember, he was a Marine Corps officer. So he understands exactly what it takes. And so we're talking about years for them to be used properly. So this is the calculation here, years, not months, but years. And I think that's a really important thing to remember here, because we're going to hear about the US and NATO sending weapons to Ukraine for some time to come, as long as this conflict is going on. But if you understand that these weapon systems are not just toys that you play around with, that they take a lot of training, understanding, right? The one thing about the military industrial complex that's so important to note is that actually the United States as a whole really has relied on this military industrial complex, not just for the military side of its overall political and economic system, but also on the technological side. So a lot of the things that we love, even what we're talking on right here, the internet and whatnot, all those cables and the technology that has come out from the internet was actually DoD produced. So the United States has relied on the Department of Defense, on its massive expenditures over the last several decades to produce some of its highest end technology. That's just the fact of the matter. But here, now you're trying to get Ukraine, a largely underdeveloped country, a country that has not fought in any war since the Soviet Union fought against the fascists, the Nazis in World War II. It hasn't been part of any kind of conflict like that. It had been weakened and decimated, and then the coups only created more instability. Now you're asking this country, this government, to take these higher technical and more difficult weapons to operate and to use them against Russia, which has a stable military. And honestly, as Brian mentioned about the Soviet weapons, Russia has been able to not just wield those that it inherited, but also to update them. And it has not faced the same supply chain issues as US and NATO has in this war, where Ukraine is just blowing through all of the weaponry that it receives. So obviously, there's a lot here, but let's continue, because he's going to talk more about this Iraq Ukraine connection, which is important, because it's important to note that Iraq is not the same thing as Russia. You can't compare the two, even though military analysts are trying to do so.
Into their military, and it still made no difference. We don't hear about TB2 drones anymore. Now, in another video by Alexander Mikuris of the Duran, and again, it will be linked to in the video description below, he talks about this article from 1945, Ukraine won't get Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams tanks. Does it matter? This is by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, so another U.S. military officer with experience specifically in armor. And Well, now we learn that Ukraine is going to get Leopards and Abrams, but he describes all of the problems that Ukraine is going to face trying to use these, and why they're not going to be as effective as people seem to think. He says, will these high-tech tanks, if Ukraine eventually gets them, transform the Ukrainian armed forces into a modern force that can drive Russia out later this spring? The chances aren't as great as many believe. And then he says, in Desert Storm, US M1A1 Abrams tanks wiped out Saddam Hussein's fleets of Soviet-made T-72s. And again, the American Abrams-led invasion in 2003 revealed the T-72 was no match for US tanks. And truly, the American tanks were witheringly successful. During Desert Storm, for example, the US and its coalition partners destroyed more than 3,000 Iraqi tanks. Saddam's armored forces, however, did not destroy even a single Abrams tank. It is understandable then why anyone would want to have an Abrams or equivalent tank, especially when it has proven so effective against exactly the type of tanks Russia has. And Alexander in his video points out that the T-72 tanks in Iraq during these two conflicts he mentions are completely different than the T-72s that are being used in Ukraine right now by Russia. These T-72s have been heavily modernized. They have modern computerized fire control systems, they have night and thermal imaging optics, and they have explosive reactive armor, which is a huge upgrade, a step up from the steel armor that the T-72 was originally designed with, and which was what Iraq had on the battlefield. So all three of these factors make a huge difference. And you will see why in just a moment, because Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis is going to explain what is most important in a tank battle. He says,
So I wanted to stop it before he goes on, because that's the last point for Brian that I wanted to bring up here. But we'll get into a little bit more with what he's about to say. But I think yes, there is this comparison of Iraq to Russia, right? That somehow fighting Iraq or invading Iraq and destroying Iraq with these kind of weapons is the same as confronting Russia in the way the United States is trying to do right now via Ukraine. And it's just not the case. Even if you don't have all this military expertise, even if you don't understand the differences in these weapon systems and capabilities, I mean, anyone can understand Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world. It has one of the most high-tech militaries in the world. It has remained that way. That was one of the things that shock therapy did not completely dismantle and disintegrate. And it's one of the things that Vladimir Putin and Russia has focused a lot on, because this has been years in the making, building up. Russia has felt that with NATO expansion, it has had to focus on its own military capabilities in case of a conflict like the one they're in right now. So Russia has been preparing. Russia has a military industrial complex itself that is comparable, if not more favorable than the United States is, given that Russia is where it is. Russia is in the east. It is bordering Ukraine. It does have many advantages, and it has organized its military and fortified its military in preparation for conflicts like the one that we're seeing. So Iraq is much different. Iraq was the United States using heavy armament, using everything that it had to destroy a country that did not have anywhere near the capabilities as Russia. So I think it's a huge stretch, but it is revealing in the sense that the empire, the U.S. empire, its collective West vassals are willing to make this connection to try to make a point that Ukraine should get these weapons and that they will somehow be effective. But I think it's a real stretch and a real reach. And Brian is breaking down why. And let's hear what he has to say to conclude on this point.
In tank fights, the side that accurately fires first almost always wins. In Desert Storm, we almost always fired first, and because of our training, almost never missed. But when the Iraqi gunners got off a shot, it was rarely on target. The results were fatal for them. Now, the T-72 tanks that Russia has in Ukraine, they're going to be able to see Ukrainian tanks as soon or sooner than Ukrainian tanks will see them. They have computerized fire control systems. When they aim a shot, they're almost certainly going to hit on the first try. If people remember the video I did about Wally, the super sniper from Canada, his last mission in Ukraine was trying to hunt a Russian modern main battle tank. He had a team of 4. 2 of the 4 teammates were killed instantly when a Russian tank saw them and killed them both on the first shot. He never managed to hit that Russian tank. with his javelin, because these are modernized T-72s. They have modern optics. They can see you shortly before you see them, day or night, in any weather condition. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis points out another extremely important factor, perhaps the most important factor. The U.S. crewmen were highly trained as individuals. In my unit, tank drivers, loaders, gunners, and vehicle commanders had all mastered their individual jobs. Then, for more than a year before battle, had conducted considerable time training as platoons, then company level, and later we trained in squadron and eventually regimental levels. No one could have been more ready to fight than we were. Think about what he's saying. He's not saying that all of these people only trained for a year and then they were capable of what they achieved. They had already mastered the skills of operating a tank and operating a tank individually along with other tanks as part of a unit. They had already mastered these skills, and then they specifically trained for a whole year for this operation. If you remember the build-ups to Desert Storm and also the invasion in 2003, these were extended periods of time, and the U.S. military used this time to train their forces specifically for the invasion. And then he continues about the Iraqis. This is what he says. Iraq had done virtually none of these things. We later discovered their crew members had minimum training, had rarely, if ever, fired their main guns in training, did very little unit level training, and their maintenance programs, far more important in tank operations than commonly understood, was virtually non-existent. In short, the T-72 operators were poorly trained while our side was highly trained.
So I think that's all you need to really know in this circumstance, in this situation, is that this comparison is incredibly it's just a fantasy, right? This comparison of saying, well, these M1 Abrams, these tanks that the US and NATO are providing Ukraine are somehow going to change and shift the tide. They're going to turn the tide here on the battlefield, when this comparison with Iraq, this citation of Iraq as being an example of how effective these weapons were. Well, you heard Brian there. Iraq was an underdeveloped country. It had already been through a major war, the Gulf War, right? It had been through major calamities, right? It had Desert Storm, right? Was during the Gulf War, and it was just not in the position. It was not in any position to fight and beat back. It had been, remember, just a history lesson here. Iraq did participate in the Arab-Israeli war, as it's known, right? That war, which was also quite damaging and divided up the Arab world quite a lot in the struggle for Israel to cement more dominance in the region. So Iraq was in no position. It was an underdeveloped country. You know, the Sykes-Picot, the divisions, all of that. No matter how much the Ba'ath Party in Iraq had tried to develop Iraq's economy and had done so, it had been strained by a war with Iran, the prior war with Israel. There was no way that it could compete with the United States' essentially unused, untested, the United States had all the time in the world. This is the advantage that the United States always has, had, I should say. This is the advantage the United States had when it decided to launch this war on terror. It had all of this time, all of this preparation it could make to get ready to destroy Afghanistan and Iraq with its weapons. It could take that year long. It could take that year's time to train its military forces to do what it did, this destructive and just disgusting imperial venture or imperial ventures in this region. Ukraine doesn't have that time. The United States was not subject to some kind of proxy war on itself. This is something the United States has had an advantage with over the course of its history, especially when it became the imperial hegemon. It didn't have to worry about an external threat. No matter how much it wanted to talk about communism and the Soviet Union and China, it didn't have to worry about that. Ukraine borders Russia. Ukraine is being used as a proxy against Russia by the US and NATO. Ukraine is embattled in a war of attrition where they've lost hundreds of thousands, as well as how many of these weapons it's already received, the HIMARS, the javelins, the artillery, ammunition, all of it gone, and more gone. What about this says that these tanks aren't going to receive the same treatment? Russia is saying they're going to receive the same treatment. Russia is saying that these tanks will be struck. These tanks will be taken out. There's no difference between these tanks or any other tanks. It doesn't matter if they're Soviet weapons or US and NATO weapons. They're going to be treated all the same. And you should believe Russia, because Russia has been making quick work of Ukraine's infrastructure and now is pushing forward with its mobilization. So this idea that Iraq, right, can be compared to Russia in any way, that this is going to work out for them, is easily debunked. And Brian Berletic has that expertise where he can explain, and I can't disagree with him here, that all of this training, there need to be years of training before you specifically learn how to use this device, which takes up to a year. So this is possibly a disaster in the making. This is possibly just a way for the United States to send more Ukrainians out to slaughter and give them the potential to slaughter more than they already are of Russian forces and of forces in the Donbass. But how can it turn the tide of the war if these forces can't use them properly and might not even be able to use them months from now? Even months from now is too long. It's too long. Russia's not going to sit on its hands, and it's not going to twiddle its thumbs as Ukraine prepares to use these devices. No. What is Russia doing right now? Russia is demilitarizing Ukraine. It is taking out its military infrastructure. It's taking out whatever infrastructure supports that military hardware. It is targeting specific points of this line that Ukraine's military is trying to push through, is trying to expand, is trying to move into the Donbass. Russia is going to keep its operations going, and it's highly likely, while we don't have, we can't predict, we can see the trends already emerging in places like Soledar and Bakhmut and Zaporozhye. We see the trend emerging that Russia is taking back more and more territories, taking more and more territory from Ukraine. And there's nothing that indicates that that's going to change. So while these tanks, of course, create a dangerous situation, as Chris had just said earlier on the program, it is a dangerous situation. Here's why I think it's dangerous. Not so much that the tanks are going to cause all this damage, but that the potential, right? It's kind of like opening the floodgates. You give a few of these tanks, they may not change the scene on the battlefield, but what these tanks may do is create more of a kind of a pipeline where NATO sends more and more and more heavy weaponry to build Ukraine up. And that will pressure Russia to accelerate its own plans, which then has this feedback loop, because the United States does not want to see Ukraine fall. It doesn't want to see Ukraine lose the war. It's going to keep on trying to ensure that at the very least, Ukraine stands no matter how many dead bodies pile up. Now, the United States doesn't really care about dead bodies, dead Ukrainian bodies, any kind of dead bodies, because how many mass graves has the United States created in places like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan? We can go on and on and on. I mean, this isn't any, there's no empathy there for that development and that phenomenon. But the point is that the more that Russia feels pressured then to escalate and to move even faster than it has been, then the possibility, in my opinion, I agree with Brian Berletic, that Western Ukraine could eventually see itself become this kind of protectorate, this buffer zone, because they won't be able to withstand Russia's pressure and its support of the Donbass in the east. Right, that I could see that happening, that West Ukraine kind of becomes its own entity, and then we see the division of Ukraine happening, in real time and becoming formalized in some way. But I think that there's also a potential for a no-fly zone conversation to reemerge. You remember back in the beginning of this conflict, there were these chicken hawks, these war hawks, neocons, calling for a no-fly zone, which would be akin to World War III when the conflict first began. That died down as the Biden administration said, hold on, can't get into that mess and that noise right now, because that would just escalate things to the point of collapsing the political legitimacy of the United States. And also it would create a direct conflict with Russia via NATO, right? So that couldn't work at that time. But the more that you send this heavier equipment and you try to have it used, and the more that you have an interest, which the US will have, in making sure that these tanks, you send them out willy-nilly, you send them out without the proper training, they can't be properly used, they're going to be heavy targets. So that creates pressure to protect this weaponry, because what kind of public relations scene would it be to see all across Russian media, maybe even some Western media outlets will pick this up, burning M1 Abrams in the streets of Ukraine, burning a Leopard 2 tanks from Germany or from wherever else, burning in Ukraine? What would that look like? It would look like that Russia actually has superiority in this conflict and would collapse the narrative that the United States is helping Ukraine win. It would destroy the legitimacy of what we're seeing here with the Ukraine conflict. It would burst asunder all the illusions that we here on this channel have been trying to burst asunder since the beginning of this conflict. That's what would happen. So that's why I believe it's dangerous, because it provides the United States and NATO are actually creating a foundation to further escalate, because they will need to, because what they're doing is not enough. They know that, Russia knows that. And so that's why it is this dangerous trend that could lead further and further into an abyss of an unthinkable conflict and direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, which Russia already feels like it is in the midst of, but it can get a lot worse. And the United States and NATO, through these tank announcements and through this commitment of heavier and heavier weaponry to Ukraine, they're the ones making it happen. And we have to be clear about that. They're the ones making it happen, not Russia. They're the ones destroying Ukraine, not Russia.